It started quietly, in ways almost impossible to notice at first. Saad had always been attentive. Not overly, not in a cloying way, but in the way a mother recognizes instantly. The small gestures, the little considerations, the softness in a voice when you speak. He had that naturally. I knew every glance, every word, every pause. But after Sanaa came into our lives, something changed. Not drastically, not like a sudden storm, more like a shift in the tide, imperceptible at first. Only, slowly, that tide carried away the familiar shores I had once occupied in his life. I remember the first evening clearly. We were having dinner, just the three of us. The aroma of spices and simmering curry filled the room, and I had been talking about a small incident from Saad's childhood, something funny that I thought he would enjoy. He smiled politely. That same warm, attentive smile I knew so well. But then, his eyes flickered toward Sanaa. A slight exchange, almost imperceptible. And for the first time, I felt paused. He didn't finish the conversation with me. Instead, the story became theirs. They laughed together, a shared understanding in their glances. I listened, smiled, nodded. But there was a subtle hollow space beside me where connection used to be effortless. I tried to dismiss it. Perhaps it was my imagination. Perhaps I was being overly sensitive. But over the next few days, patterns emerged. Simple things. Like Saad asking Sanaa first when a decision needed to be made. The way he leaned slightly toward her while listening to a story I had already started telling. The little details. Who sat where, what words he chose, the way laughter bubbled between them, but seemed to pause when I spoke. I had raised him to be kind, to be thoughtful, and he remained those things. He had not changed in the ways I feared. But the subtle shift, almost invisible to anyone else, weighed heavily on me. I began noticing the moments I would start to speak, and he wouldn't wait. He had something else to say, or his attention drifted elsewhere. Sometimes it was deliberate. Often it wasn't. And that distinction made the pain sharper. It wasn't rejection. It was redirection. I told myself that it was natural. That marriages create a new center, a new priority. And yet, even when I reasoned it away, my heart felt the quiet dislocation. One morning, I found myself preparing breakfast, carefully setting the table for the three of us, and I realized I was hesitating before asking Saad a simple question. Not because he had ever refused to answer, but because I anticipated the space he would leave for Sanaa first. Even mundane questions were now filtered through invisible boundaries. At first, I tried to explain to myself, it's just adjustment, a phase. Soon, the balance will return. But then came small, undeniable moments that shook that belief. Sanaa had baked a cake one afternoon for no reason, and Saad raved over it, taking bites and laughing in ways he used to laugh with me. I watched, smiling. Truly, I smiled. I wanted them to be happy. But there was a pinch of something I couldn't name, something like sadness mixed with awe. I remembered when Saad used to bring me small joys, a drawing from school, a note, a glance that said, I value you, I need you. Those moments hadn't stopped entirely, but they had become rarer, measured, fleeting. And I realized something quietly painful. The shift was permanent. It didn't feel dramatic. There were no slamming doors, no harsh words, no confrontations. Just life moving forward, and me slowly realizing I was no longer at the heart of it in the way I used to be. I spent the evenings in my room thinking, reflecting. I questioned myself endlessly. Had I done something wrong? Was I too strict? Too indulgent? Too soft? Did I expect too much attention for being a mother? None of these questions had answers. They weren't even questions that required answers. They were reflections, silent, internal, a dialogue I had learned to conduct alone. It was in those quiet hours that I first understood what it meant to be overlooked without being ignored. No one had excluded me, and no one had slighted me. I was still loved. But the love had taken on a new shape. A shape that didn't require me to explain myself anymore. A shape that was no longer centered around my needs, my attention, my presence. That realization was both liberating and frightening. I remembered instances from earlier months when I had caught myself over-explaining, offering clarifications, justifying emotions, smoothing over moments to avoid conflict. I had always prided myself on being patient, on maintaining harmony. But now, even that patience felt optional. I stopped mid-sentence one day, halfway through explaining a memory from Saad's childhood, because I realized no explanation was needed. It wasn't a slight if they didn't ask. It wasn't rejection if they didn't react the way I expected. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. I stopped explaining myself. Not angrily, not rebelliously, not dramatically. Simply, I stopped. That day, I discovered a strange kind of freedom. Freedom from justification, freedom from expectation, freedom from needing to interpret every glance or every pause. I began observing more than speaking. Watching became my new language. Silence became my tool, my teacher. Every small gesture from Saad and Sana told me what words could not, where I stood in this new chapter of life. Somewhere between smiles and nods, between shared glances that didn't include me, I realized I had entered a new phase of motherhood, a quieter, more reflective one. One in which my role wasn't diminished, but transformed. It was not easy. It was not painless. It was not immediate, but it was inevitable. And for the first time, I saw clearly that explaining myself would not change this new reality. It would not reclaim the intimacy I once had. It could only disrupt the flow of love that had evolved naturally between my son and his wife. That day, I chose stillness over argument, observation over participation, acceptance over explanation. And that decision, small as it was, marked the beginning of a journey I would not have anticipated. A journey toward understanding that silence can teach more than words. That letting go of constant justification can be an act of love for yourself and for those around you. And so, as I finished preparing the dishes that evening, I felt a quiet resolve settling in my chest. I would still love them deeply, that I would still guide when necessary, that I would still care endlessly. But I would no longer explain myself. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever, unless asked. Because some lessons are learned best through quiet observation, and some transformations are inevitable, whether acknowledged or not. That was the day my life changed. Not dramatically. Not violently, just silently, internally, irrevocably. And that was enough. The days after I stopped explaining myself felt strangely different. I had anticipated tension, resistance, maybe even confusion. But there was none of that. Saad didn't ask for clarification. Sana didn't look puzzled. Life, as always, continued. And in that continuation, I realized a subtle truth. The world doesn't halt for anyone's internal revelations. I began noticing my own reactions in small, quiet ways. In the mornings, I lingered longer over my tea, watching sunlight spread across the living room floor. I observed the rhythm of their household, the hum of conversation, the laughter, the minor debates over trivial things, the way Saad would glance at Sana before answering a question, the small gestures that seemed effortless. I had been present for all of it before, but now I noticed without needing to participate. Observation became my new form of presence. At first, I felt a strange emptiness in that silence. It was as though a part of me had been stripped away without consent. I caught myself almost speaking, almost inserting myself into moments, only to pause mid-thought. And with each pause, I felt a quiet strength growing inside me. This withdrawal was not about resentment. It was not about anger. It was about preservation. I realized that constant explanation, constant justification, had slowly drained me. Every time I clarified an emotion, every time I tried to make myself understood, I was pouring my energy into a place where it was no longer required. And now, by simply stepping back, I was reclaiming that energy, quietly, deliberately. I watched Saad one afternoon, sitting across from Sana in the kitchen, discussing plans for the week. His eyes moved naturally between her and their notes. They spoke with ease, laughter bubbling between them, light teasing interspersed with serious consideration. I felt something in me tighten, a mix of longing, nostalgia, and that ever-present sense of distance. But instead of responding with words, I simply smiled to myself. I let the moment exist without needing my permission, my input, my voice. That was new. That was strange. I remembered how much I had once equated my worth with my ability to influence, to guide, to correct, to explain. In that old framework, silence felt dangerous. It felt like surrender. But now I saw silence differently. It was protective. It was clarifying. It was revealing. I spent more time walking through our small garden. I observed the way the sun hit the leaves, the rhythm of the birds, the subtle sway of the flowers in the breeze. Nature did not demand my explanation. It simply existed. And I began to see that I could exist the same way, quietly, fully, without justification. Saad noticed, though not overtly. He would occasionally glance in my direction and offer a soft smile, or a casual comment about the weather or a small household matter. It was not the intense engagement of the past, but it was recognition. And recognition, I realized, was enough. Sanaa, too, seemed to sense the shift. She began including me in small, almost instinctive ways, asking if I wanted a cup of tea, leaving space beside me when we watched television, sharing lighthearted stories without expecting a response. I didn't need to explain anything to appreciate these gestures. They spoke their own language of acknowledgement. Evenings were the hardest. The quiet of the house emphasized the subtle absence I felt during the day. I would hear their laughter, the rustle of movement, the occasional soft exclamation or joke, and I would feel the pang of invisibility. But now, instead of trying to fix it, I allowed it to exist. I allowed myself to be part of the atmosphere without being the center of it. That distinction became empowering. One particular evening stands out. We were having dinner, and the conversation was lively. Saad shared a story about work, Sanaa added commentary, and relatives who had come over joined in. I had a memory I wanted to share, a small anecdote about Saad as a child, but I stopped myself. Instead of insisting or elaborating, I simply smiled, enjoying the collective energy. I realized that my presence alone was contribution enough. That night, alone in my room, I reflected on the small moments of the day. I felt fatigue, yes, a quiet, emotional fatigue. But it was not despair. It was the exhaustion of unlearning a lifetime of habits, of expectations, of the belief that my explanations were always necessary. I realized I had been explaining myself my entire life, not just to Saad and Sanaa, but to everyone around me, to family, to friends, to myself. Every reaction, every feeling, every choice had been justified, clarified, smoothed. And that pattern, though rooted in care and love, had limited me. By choosing not to explain, I began to notice the freedom in simply being. I didn't need validation for my presence. I didn't need approval for my choices. I didn't need anyone to measure my worth. There were, of course, pangs of guilt. Moments when I wondered if I had been too withdrawn, if my silence could be misunderstood as disinterest or coldness. But I reminded myself gently, the truth of my feelings did not require constant explanation. Love existed quietly, steadily, whether articulated or not. Over time, I began to see the subtle ways my new approach affected the household. Saad spoke more freely when I stopped anticipating his responses. He no longer paused mid-thought, as if checking my reaction. Sanaa's ease with me grew. She did not need to navigate around my emotions or reactions. There was a new rhythm in the house, one that allowed for individual space while preserving collective warmth. I discovered that stepping back did not weaken my relationships. It strengthened them. By stopping the constant explanations, I allowed room for authenticity, for Saad to be his true self, for Sanaa to fully participate, and for me to occupy my own quiet space. I began journaling in the evenings, noting small observations, gestures, laughter, unspoken communications, moments of beauty in their togetherness. Writing allowed me to process emotions without burdening anyone else. It became a sanctuary for reflection and understanding. In those days, I also began to reflect more deeply on my own identity outside of my roles as mother, wife, and caregiver. I explored hobbies I had neglected, reading novels I loved, tending to the garden with deliberate attention, walking through our neighborhood in silence, absorbing the rhythm of the world around me. These small acts became affirmations of self, reminders that my existence was valuable, even when I wasn't explaining it to anyone. And slowly, imperceptibly, I felt a shift in my own heart. The emotional weight of being constantly seen, constantly justified, began to lift. I was no longer tethered to the expectation of acknowledgement. My love for my family did not diminish, it transformed. I could hold them close without needing to assert my presence. It was a quiet revolution, internal and profound. I knew, deep down, that this new path would not be easy. There would be moments of nostalgia, moments of longing for the days when explanations and clarifications were a natural part of our interactions. But the lessons were clear. Life moves forward, roles evolve, and the measure of love is not in constant validation but in consistent, patient presence. And in that understanding, I began to feel the first real sense of emotional balance since Saad married. I had stopped explaining myself. And in that cessation, I had begun to reclaim a part of myself I didn't realize I had lost. Silence had become my teacher, observation my language, acceptance my strength. And for the first time in years, I felt a quiet confidence that was mine alone. Not dependent on reaction, not conditional on acknowledgement, simply present, simply steady, simply me. The quietest moments are often the loudest. I had been observing for weeks, embracing my silence, stepping back from constant explanation. I believed I had found serenity. Yet, in the solitude of reflection, I began to feel a subtle tension, an almost imperceptible knot in my chest that refused to untangle itself. It was not anger. It was not resentment. It was a quiet frustration, the kind that simmers under a calm exterior, whispering truths you are reluctant to acknowledge. I noticed it first during family dinners. The conversation flowed easily between Saad and Sanaa. Laughter, jokes, shared memories, it was effortless, seamless. I smiled, nodded, occasionally offered a word. But the words felt unnecessary. My presence was peripheral, not ignored, not dismissed, but peripheral. And that peripheral space, though safe, carried weight. I caught myself rehearsing thoughts that I would never speak. Do they notice I am here? Do they see the small ways I still care? Am I fading into the background entirely? Each question was unspoken. Each remained quietly lodged in my chest. I realized something. Stopping explanations had freed me in one way, but trapped me in another. I no longer poured myself into justifying feelings or clarifying intentions. I was at peace with that part. But I had not accounted for the emotional vacuum it created, the tension of being present without impact, of caring without acknowledgement. I began to notice small patterns that stung more than they should. When Saad recounted a childhood story, it no longer flowed into shared laughter that included me. Instead, he and Sanaa exchanged a knowing glance, finishing details I might have added. Their intimacy was natural, effortless, beautiful, and I loved them for it. But I also felt invisible. The realization hit slowly. Each missed reference, each omitted gesture, each story I did not need to explain, it all accumulated into a quiet frustration I could neither voice nor erase. One afternoon, I found myself lingering in the hallway as they arranged plans for the weekend. Saad asked Sanaa for her thoughts before he looked at me. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't meant to hurt. It was habit, a natural shift in priorities. And yet, the subtle sting of it washed over me. I realized that even though I had stopped explaining myself, I still yearned to be part of the current rhythm, to be acknowledged in the present rather than only in reflection. I tried to reconcile these feelings in the privacy of my mind. I thought back to the years of parenting, the constant explanations, the advice given, the corrections, the clarifications. I had believed then that my words were necessary, that my presence required verbal reinforcement. And in a sense, they had been. But life had moved forward. Saad had grown. Sanaa had become part of his world. And I had not. Not in the same way. It wasn't failure. It was evolution. Yet the human heart is stubborn. It notices absence. It measures space. It longs for inclusion, even when it is no longer needed. That evening, as I folded laundry in the quiet of my room, I felt a small wave of helplessness. I was doing all the right things. I observed, I offered gentle guidance when appropriate, I practiced patience, I stopped explaining myself. And still, the pull of frustration lingered. I wondered if this was what many parents experience when their children create new families. A soft, relentless awareness that the center of attention has shifted, leaving them to navigate a new, peripheral role. I realized I was not angry at Saad or Sanaa. I was not resentful. I loved them deeply and completely. But love alone does not erase emotional tension. It does not eliminate the quiet ache of unspoken needs. The next few days, I tested myself in subtle ways. I observed the moments I wanted to intervene in, to clarify a point, to offer insight from years of experience. And each time, I stopped myself. I allowed silence to reign. Sometimes it was painful. Sometimes it was confusing. And sometimes, the quiet frustration crept into my dreams, a lingering whisper reminding me of my changing role. Yet even in this tension, I noticed something remarkable. I was more present than I had been in years, not actively dominating the narrative. Restraint is a quiet art. It is neither submission nor indifference. It is the deliberate choice to exist without overextending oneself into the spaces of others. I discovered this art slowly, one day at a time, as I navigated my evolving role in Saad and Sanaa's life. The first morning I truly practiced restraint, it felt almost foreign. I had woken early, as I often did, the house still shrouded in soft shadows, the faint smell of brewed tea lingering from the previous night. Saad was asleep. Sanaa was preparing breakfast quietly in the kitchen. I had a thought, a correction, a suggestion, something that would, in my past life, have prompted me to speak. But I stopped. I inhaled slowly. I let the thought dissolve into the room. Nothing happened. The world continued. Sanaa hummed a gentle tune. Saad stretched and yawned. The house felt alive and full, yet my voice had not been necessary to shape that fullness. That realization settled in my chest like a stone being lifted. I began to understand that restraint was not about inaction. It was about choosing the moments that mattered and allowing the rest to unfold naturally. Over the next few days, I tested this discipline in subtle ways. When Saad and Sanaa debated household arrangements or schedules, I no longer interjected. I observed, absorbing their words and gestures, noticing the rhythm of their negotiation. Sometimes I had advice. Sometimes I had insight born of years of experience. But I held it. I let them find their own way, trusting that they could navigate life without my constant explanations or approvals. At first, my silence felt like sacrifice. A small, private ache lingered in my chest, reminding me of all the times I would have spoken. But then, I noticed something remarkable. The tension in the household began to shift. Saad's voice gained a subtle confidence. Sanaa's suggestions flowed more freely. Their interactions became a dance of mutual understanding without my interventions. And in witnessing that, I felt a quiet pride. I began to realize that restraint was a form of love, perhaps the truest form. It was not about controlling outcomes or shaping decisions. It was about allowing those you love to grow, to make mistakes, to learn, and to thrive, while remaining a steady presence, ready to guide if absolutely necessary, but never demanding attention or validation. One afternoon, Saad came to me with a small concern about work. In the past, I would have asked endless questions, offered advice, guided him through every possible option. But now, I simply listened. I let him speak, absorbing his words, his frustrations, his hopes. When he finished, I offered a few gentle suggestions, brief and unobtrusive. He nodded, thanked me, and returned to his tasks. It was ordinary. But in that ordinariness, I felt the profound power of restraint. I had allowed space for him to speak, to think, to resolve his own concerns. And that, I realized, was love expressed through silence. Evenings became lessons in subtle patience. I watched Saad and Sanaa prepare dinner together, their movements synchronized, their laughter flowing naturally. I felt the familiar pang of invisibility at times, but I did not act on it. I did not insert myself into their harmony. Instead, I observed quietly, appreciating the beauty of their partnership without needing to influence it. This practice extended beyond interactions with my family. It became a meditation, a quiet discipline that affected how I moved through the world. I restrained my judgments, my assumptions, my impulses to correct or explain. I allowed things to be as they were, recognizing that my voice, though valuable, was not always necessary. I began journaling more frequently. My entries were simple: observations of gestures, moments of joy, the rhythm of everyday life. I reflected on my own reactions, noting when restraint brought peace and when impatience or longing crept in. Writing became a companion, helping me understand the intricate balance between presence and distance. I also started to notice the subtle ways restraint reshaped my own emotions. The constant ache for acknowledgement softened. The urge to explain, to justify, to control outcomes diminished. I felt lighter, more grounded, more connected to myself. And in that grounding, I found the beginnings of true patience, not the patience that waits reluctantly, but the patience that observes, accepts, and trusts. One evening, as I prepared tea for all of us, Saad paused to smile at me. It was not a smile demanding recognition. It was not a smile seeking validation. It was a simple acknowledgement of presence, quiet and warm. I returned the smile, feeling a subtle thrill of connection that no words could amplify. I realized then that restraint does not mean absence. It does not mean detachment. It is an active choice to exist fully, while allowing others to exist fully, too. It is a balance between presence and permission. In the quiet weeks that followed, I tested this balance in increasingly subtle ways. I observed moments when I could have spoken, moments when I could have inserted myself into decisions, moments when I could have explained emotions. And each time I paused, I allowed silence to govern the moment. Sometimes, I felt a flash of frustration, a reminder that old habits die slowly. But I reminded myself gently, this was not about winning or losing. This was about cultivating a space where love and life could unfold naturally, without the constant need for validation. Through this practice, I began to notice subtle shifts in Saad and Sanaa as well. They spoke more openly, moved more freely, laughed more spontaneously. The house, once filled with my explanatory voice, now hummed with a gentle rhythm of independent harmony. I had not stepped away. I had stepped back. And in that distance, life had room to breathe. Restraint, I discovered, was not a burden. It was a form of liberation. I no longer felt compelled to explain myself, to justify my emotions, to shape every interaction. I could exist fully, quietly, confidently, without needing permission or acknowledgement. And in that liberation, I discovered a new dimension of love, one that did not demand attention, one that did not require constant articulation. Love expressed itself through presence, through observation, through quiet support. It was a love that endured because it did not cling. I realized that this lesson, though learned in the context of my evolving role with Saad and Sanaa, was universal. It applied to every relationship I had ever held, every connection I had ever nurtured. The need to explain, to justify, to insist, these were human tendencies, but they were not necessary for love to thrive. That night, as I sat alone with my journal, I wrote, "Restraint is not absence. Restraint is recognition. Restraint is trust. And trust, once cultivated, allows love to grow quietly, powerfully, and endlessly." I had learned the art of restraint. I had begun to understand its profound influence on both my own heart and the hearts of those I loved. And though the path ahead would continue to test patience and emotional endurance, I felt ready. Ready to exist fully without explanation, ready to observe without interference, ready to love without expectation. Because in restraint, I had found not limitation but freedom. There is a certain clarity that comes not with words, but with observation. For weeks, I had practiced restraint, holding my tongue, stepping back, letting life unfold around Saad and Sanaa. I had begun to notice changes, not just in them, but in myself. But the true emotional realization, the one that quietly, inexorably seeped into my heart, came one morning in the simplest of ways. I was preparing breakfast, the soft smell of toast and coffee filling the kitchen. Saad entered, casually discussing his day, while Sanaa moved around arranging plates and utensils. They spoke seamlessly, intuitively, laughing over an inside joke. I paused, spoon in hand, and I realized something I hadn't admitted before. I was no longer central in their shared world. The thought hit me gently, yet firmly, like a cool breeze across my skin. I had known it intellectually. I had observed it with my practiced eye. But now, emotionally, I felt it. A weight settled in my chest, not heavy, but persistent. I was still loved. I knew that. Saad's kindness, his attention when needed, the small gestures that never failed to acknowledge me, these remained. But they were not the same as before. My place in his daily emotional life had shifted. I was no longer the first person he turned to, no longer the center of his laughter or worries. It was a subtle pain, one that did not scream or demand recognition. It existed quietly, like a shadow at the edge of my awareness. I reminded myself that this was natural, that marriage creates new centers, that love does not diminish because attention shifts. And yet, acknowledgement and acceptance are two different things. My mind accepted the change. My heart took longer. I found myself reflecting on the years of motherhood, the endless explanations, the gentle corrections, the stories shared, the advice given. I had once believed that my presence was indispensable, that my guidance was necessary for every moment of Saad's life. And now I realized that was no longer true. It was not a failure. It was evolution. I remembered the small gestures that had first alerted me to the shift. Saad seeking Sanaa's opinion before mine on trivial matters, the laughter they shared without including me in the punchline, the way he would glance toward her first when telling a story. At the time, I had dismissed them as inconsequential. But now, in reflection, they formed a quiet mosaic of change. And I understood that this was permanent, not in a cruel way, not in a way that demanded resistance. Simply, this was how life moved forward. That realization brought both sorrow and freedom. Sorrow, because I felt a nostalgic longing for the intimacy I once had with my son, the effortless connection, the unspoken understanding, the constant presence in each other's lives. Freedom because I no longer needed to fight for relevance. I no longer needed to explain my feelings, to justify my presence, or to seek acknowledgement. Love could exist quietly, without constant reinforcement. I began to notice how this shift affected my interactions with them. Where once I might have offered advice, now I observed. Where once I might have corrected or explained, now I paused. My silence became deliberate, a conscious act of letting go. And in that letting go, I discovered something profound. My value was not dependent on their constant attention. My love was not diminished by their independence. My presence was still meaningful, even if it no longer required daily acknowledgement. I also began to see the subtle ways Saad and Sanaa navigated this new dynamic. They included me in moments without seeking my guidance. They shared their lives, not to solicit approval, but to express trust and connection. And I realized that this trust was a deeper form of love than constant involvement. One evening, as we sat together quietly after dinner, I noticed a small moment that crystallized my understanding. Saad and Sanaa were planning a trip, discussing dates, travel arrangements, and accommodations. I listened, genuinely interested, but without inserting myself. I made a single suggestion about timing and then remained silent. They nodded, considered it, and made their plans. I felt a subtle shift in my heart. I had contributed, yes, but not in a way that demanded attention or acknowledgement. My involvement was quiet, steady, and unobtrusive. And in that quiet, I found a deep sense of fulfillment. It occurred to me then that love and presence are not measured by visibility or centrality. They are measured by consistency, by the willingness to support without controlling, by the ability to allow growth without fear of fading. The next morning, I woke with a renewed sense of purpose. I was no longer trying to occupy the center of Saad's life. I was present, loving, and supportive, but in a way that respected their independence. I understood that my role had evolved from a constant guide to a quiet observer, a steady presence in the background. This realization was liberating. I no longer felt the need to justify my actions or emotions. I no longer felt the sting of being overlooked because I understood that my presence was meaningful in ways that did not require daily acknowledgement. I began to focus on myself more intentionally. I returned to hobbies I had neglected, reading, gardening, and small creative projects. I discovered that these activities, once secondary to my role as mother and caregiver, could now bring me joy and fulfillment independent of others' needs. Even in my quiet moments, I reflected on the subtle lessons I was learning: patience, restraint, acceptance, and the ability to find peace within oneself. These lessons, though born of emotional challenge, were invaluable. They strengthened me in ways that constant engagement never could. I also began to notice the small ways my family continued to include me, even without demanding it. Saad would occasionally share a thought, a joke, or a concern, knowing I was present and attentive. Sana would ask for my opinion on minor matters, or simply include me in conversations without expectation. These moments, though fleeting, reinforced the understanding that love does not require constant articulation. It thrives quietly, through observation, support, and the subtle acknowledgement of presence. By the end of Part 5, I had internalized a powerful truth. I was no longer central in the way I once had been, and that was okay. My value, my love, and my presence remained intact. I had stopped explaining myself because it was no longer necessary. I had begun to understand that love, in its truest form, could exist quietly, steadily, without constant justification. And in that understanding, I found a deep and enduring sense of peace, one that would guide me through the evolving dynamics of our family, and one that would allow me to remain a loving, present, and independent individual in this new chapter of life. The day I truly stopped explaining myself was neither dramatic nor sudden. There were no words shouted, no confrontations, no tears spilled in defiance. It was quiet, deliberate, resolute. I had practiced restraint. I had observed without intervening. I had begun to understand my evolving role in Saad and Sana's life. And yet, I realized that as long as I allowed even small explanations to escape my lips, justifications, clarifications, rationalizations, I remained tethered to a world where my presence demanded acknowledgement. That world, I now knew, had shifted. One evening, Saad had a minor disagreement with Sana over household matters. In the past, I would have instinctively interjected. I would have clarified misunderstandings, reminded them of context, or tried to ease tension. I would have explained my feelings to both, attempting to maintain harmony. But that night, as I sat quietly in the living room, I felt a deep, steady resolve. I would not explain. I would not justify. I would not intervene. The tension between them passed naturally, as disagreements often do in healthy partnerships. They found compromise, laughter returned, and I realized that my voice had not been needed at all. And for the first time, I experienced what liberation truly felt like. I reflected on all the moments I had spent explaining myself throughout my life, to friends, to family, to colleagues, to my children. So often, I had sought to clarify emotions, to defend choices, to ensure understanding. I believed it was necessary. I believed it was a measure of love, care, and responsibility. Now, I understood it differently. Explaining myself had often been a form of self-validation. I sought acknowledgement, not from a place of pride, but from a place of insecurity. It was exhausting, invisible work, and it was no longer required. From that day onward, I practiced deliberate silence in all interactions. I listened deeply. I observed carefully. I responded only when necessary, and when I did, I spoke with intention, not compulsion. Saad noticed the change. He would glance at me occasionally, perhaps sensing the subtle shift in energy. He did not question it. He did not resist it. And in his acceptance, I found affirmation, not the kind that demanded explanation, but the kind that simply acknowledged presence and consistency. Sanaa, too, adapted. She continued to include me in moments of daily life, inviting me to participate, but without expecting justification for my choices or thoughts. The subtle balance we had created allowed all three of us to exist fully in the space of our shared lives. I began to notice the emotional liberation this brought. The constant mental rehearsal of responses, the anxiety over how my words would be received, the subtle tension of anticipating judgment, these all began to dissipate. Silence became my shield, my teacher, my ally. I learned that stopping explanations did not mean withdrawing love. On the contrary, it allowed me to offer love in its purest form, steady, unobtrusive, patient. I could care without control. I could support without suffocating. I could be present without asserting myself unnecessarily. The first true test of this discipline came unexpectedly. Saad and Sanaa were planning a family gathering, debating minor details about timing and seating arrangements. In the past, I might have interjected, offering suggestions, clarifying misunderstandings, or even mediating subtle tensions. But this time, I remained silent. I observed. I listened. I allowed them to navigate the discussion independently. They handled it with grace, humor, and mutual respect. And I felt an unfamiliar yet profound pride, not in my involvement, but in their capability. I had released the need to explain, to guide, to control. And in that release, I felt free. That night, I reflected on the subtle lessons I was learning. Life moves forward, roles evolve, and the need to justify oneself is often unnecessary. Love, patience, and presence are far more powerful than words of explanation. I began journaling with renewed intensity, capturing small observations, the way Saad and Sanaa interacted, the gestures that conveyed care without words, the moments of laughter and understanding that existed without my intervention. Each note reinforced the truth I was embracing. Explanation is not required for love to endure. Even in my quiet moments of solitude, I felt the liberation of this choice. I walked through our small garden, noticing the subtle dance of sunlight across leaves, the gentle sway of flowers in the breeze, the rhythm of birdsong. None of it demanded explanation. None of it required justification. It simply existed. And in observing, I felt a kinship with the world itself, a world that thrived in its own rhythms, independent of my voice. I began to recognize the subtle ways this practice affected Saad and Sanaa as well. They spoke freely, laughed naturally, navigated minor conflicts without seeking my input. Their confidence and independence became a testament to the power of restraint and the quiet strength that comes from letting go. There were moments, of course, when old habits tugged at me. I would feel the urge to explain a thought, clarify an emotion, or guide a decision. But each time I paused, I breathed deeply. I reminded myself that love does not require constant articulation, and that my presence, steady and silent, was enough. Through this practice, I discovered a deeper layer of trust in Saad, trust in Sanaa, trust in myself. I trusted that they could navigate life without my constant explanations. I trusted that love would remain intact, even without words. And I trusted that I could exist fully in the space I occupied without needing to justify my place. This emotional liberation began to extend beyond our family life. I found myself approaching friends, neighbors, and acquaintances with a similar quiet confidence. I listened more, spoke less, and allowed interactions to unfold naturally. The need to clarify or justify my choices diminished. I felt lighter, freer, more present in every moment. One evening, as I watched Saad and Sanaa preparing dinner together, I felt a profound sense of peace. They moved in harmony, their laughter flowing naturally, their gestures intuitive. I sat nearby, observing without interference, feeling the steady warmth of connection that did not demand explanation. It was a small, ordinary moment, yet it encapsulated everything I had learned. That love and presence do not require constant justification, that restraint and observation can be more powerful than words, that silence, when embraced intentionally, can teach lessons words never could. By the end of part 6, I had fully internalized a quiet truth. Stopping explanations entirely did not mean withdrawing from life or love. It meant existing fully, confidently, and intentionally. It meant observing without controlling, loving without asserting, and participating without dominating. I had discovered a freedom I had never known, a freedom born not of rebellion, but of understanding, acceptance, and patience. And in that freedom, I found not only peace, but strength, the strength to navigate the evolving dynamics of our family, to embrace my changing role without resistance, and to love deeply without needing to justify that love in words. There is a subtle power in watching without intervening. It is quiet, almost invisible, yet profound in its effect. Weeks had passed since I made the conscious decision to stop explaining myself entirely. I had embraced silence as strength, patience as a form of love, and observation as my primary tool of presence. And yet, the depth of this practice revealed itself slowly, in moments both ordinary and extraordinary. I began to notice patterns I had never truly seen before. The way Saad paused slightly when considering Sanaa's suggestions, weighing them with a thoughtfulness that reflected deep respect. The way Sanaa adjusted her tone and gestures depending on the mood of the moment, effortlessly reading the room, the energy, the subtle undercurrents of emotion. These were small details, almost imperceptible, yet they spoke volumes about the lives they were building together. I realized that my role had shifted from active participant to careful observer. And in this observation, I began to feel a quiet sense of power, not the power of control, but the power of understanding. I remember one evening in particular. Saad had returned from work, tired but smiling, and Sanaa was bustling around the kitchen preparing dinner. I sat nearby, quietly folding laundry, simply observing. They laughed together at something trivial, a shared joke, a minor mishap in the kitchen, and I felt a pang of longing for the days when I had been the center of his laughter. But instead of reaching for words, trying to insert myself into the moment, I simply smiled. I let the moment exist as it was. I realized that in my silence, in my lack of interference, I was preserving the authenticity of their interaction. My presence was quiet, unobtrusive, yet meaningful. I began to notice other subtle moments of connection. The way Saad would glance at me occasionally, a soft acknowledgement, not demanding attention, not seeking approval. The way Sanaa included me in small ways without expectation, asking if I wanted tea, leaving a chair next to me during meals, sharing minor stories that required no commentary. These gestures, though small, carried weight. They reminded me that love and inclusion do not always require active participation. As the days passed, I began to feel a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the moments I could witness, even if I was not at the center. Gratitude for the opportunity to observe growth, connection, and intimacy in my son's life, without interference. Gratitude for the subtle, steady presence I maintained, not dominant, not controlling, but quietly influential in its constancy. There were times when the old impulses returned, the urge to explain, to justify, to intervene. A minor argument over household matters, a miscommunication, a decision that I might have previously felt compelled to influence. And each time I paused. I breathed deeply. I reminded myself that my role had changed, and that silence and observation were now forms of love. I noticed that this practice also influenced my emotional state. The constant anxiety of needing to be acknowledged, of needing to assert my presence, began to dissipate. I felt lighter, freer, more centered. My heart no longer ached with every small omission or unacknowledged effort. I could exist fully in the background, yet still feel deeply connected. One afternoon, I was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when Saad came to me with a small work-related problem. I listened quietly as he explained the situation, resisting the urge to offer a lengthy explanation or solution. Instead, I offered a single, gentle suggestion, allowing him space to consider and decide. He nodded, thanked me, and walked away, confident in his choice. That moment, ordinary as it was, reinforced a profound truth. My value did not come from constant intervention. My love did not need articulation to exist. My presence was enough, simply by being steady, attentive, and patient. Evenings became a time of quiet reflection. I would watch Saad and Sanaa move through their routines, their shared laughter, the unspoken understanding, the subtle gestures of care, and I felt a deep sense of peace. I no longer measured my worth by my influence or my visibility. I measured it by the strength of my love, the constancy of my presence, and the discipline of my restraint. I began journaling more frequently, capturing the small, seemingly insignificant moments that revealed deeper truths. The way Saad held a door open for Sanaa, the way she adjusted a cushion just so he would be comfortable, the quiet conversations that passed between them without words, all of these moments became a map of connection that I could observe and appreciate without interference. Through this practice, I also discovered the subtle ways in which restraint deepened my relationships. Saad spoke more openly when I stopped anticipating his responses. Sanaa shared more freely when she no longer needed to navigate my expectations. The household rhythm became smoother, more natural, less burdened by unspoken tensions or the need for constant justification. I realized that my silence had become a gift, not only to myself but to them as well. By choosing observation over intervention, I allowed them to flourish in ways they might not have otherwise. Their growth and intimacy became a reflection of trust, respect, and the quiet strength that comes from letting go. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, I caught a fleeting glance from Saad, a soft, reflective look that spoke volumes without words. It was acknowledgement, not demanding attention, but offering connection. I returned the gaze, feeling a quiet surge of love and understanding. In that moment, I understood fully the power of presence without interference. Love does not need constant explanation. Connection does not require domination. Influence does not demand visibility. By the end of Part 7, I had internalized a profound truth. Observing without interference was not passive. It was active, deliberate, and transformative. It allowed me to exist fully, love deeply, and support without controlling. It allowed Saad and Sanaa to thrive authentically while I remained a quiet, steady presence in their lives. This realization brought both peace and confidence. Peace, in knowing that my role, though evolved, remained meaningful. Confidence, in knowing that love and presence do not require constant articulation. And as I closed my journal that night, I felt a quiet satisfaction, a gentle understanding. The art of observing without interference was not only shaping my relationship with Saad and Sanaa, it was shaping my relationship with myself. I had learned to step back, to let life unfold, to love without needing acknowledgement. And in doing so, I had discovered a deeper, more enduring form of presence, one that would carry me through the rest of this journey with patience, resilience, and quiet grace. Acceptance is quieter than surrender. It does not signal defeat, nor does it demand acknowledgement. Acceptance is a deep, deliberate choice, a willingness to see things as they are without needing to change them. By the time Part 8 unfolded in my life, I had mastered silence, restraint, and observation. I had stopped explaining myself. I had learned to love without interference. And yet, there was another layer to be discovered. The art of accepting not only others, but the evolving truth of my own emotions. It began on an ordinary morning. Saad had left early for work, his brief smile and hurried goodbye leaving me with the familiar pang of absence. Sanaa was in the kitchen, arranging breakfast quietly. I lingered near the window, watching sunlight fall on the garden. The leaves swayed in the breeze, the flowers moved gently, and for a moment, everything was still. I realized I was accepting not just their independence, but my place in their life. I was accepting the subtle distance that now existed, the quiet spaces where my voice was no longer needed. I felt a strange, almost ethereal peace in this acknowledgement. It was not immediate. The first few weeks of acceptance had been tentative. I would catch myself yearning for the closeness I once had with Saad. I would feel the subtle ache of being on the periphery, of no longer being central to every thought, every decision, every joke. But gradually, I began to see that my love did not diminish in the absence of constant engagement. It simply existed, steady, patient, unassuming. One afternoon, as I walked through the garden, I reflected on these feelings. I realized that acceptance was not passive. It was not resignation. It was active, deliberate, and transformative. I was choosing to honor reality as it was, rather than longing for what it once had been or might have been. The household itself became a mirror for this practice. Saad and Sanaa moved through their routines with ease, their interactions fluid and natural. I no longer needed to validate their choices or guide their decisions. I observed quietly, absorbing the rhythm of their life together, without feeling diminished. Yet, acceptance was not without its challenges. There were moments when small tensions surfaced, minor disagreements between Saad and Sanaa, moments of misunderstanding or miscommunication. My first instinct, ingrained over decades, was to intervene, to clarify, to explain. But I resisted. I reminded myself that acceptance meant allowing life to unfold naturally, even when it was uncomfortable. In these moments, I discovered another truth. Emotional discomfort does not always require resolution. Sometimes it is a teacher. Sometimes it is a mirror reflecting our own attachments, expectations, and unspoken needs. By allowing these tensions to exist without interference, I began to learn patience and perspective on a much deeper level. Evenings became times of quiet reflection. I would sit with a cup of tea, watching Saad and Sanaa interact, feeling the subtle shifts in energy and emotion. Their laughter, their gentle teasing, the way they anticipated each other's needs, these were small miracles of intimacy. And I learned to celebrate them quietly, without the urge to claim a role in them. I also began to notice the ways in which my own emotions were shifting. The subtle pangs of invisibility became less painful. The longing for acknowledgement softened into gentle appreciation. I discovered that my love for Saad and Sanaa could exist fully, independent of recognition or centrality. Acceptance extended beyond observation. It became a lens through which I viewed myself. I acknowledged my own feelings of nostalgia, longing, and quiet frustration without judgment. I allowed myself to grieve the shifts in my role, and I allowed myself to rejoice in the subtle joys of their lives. I began journaling more intentionally, capturing not only observations of Saad and Sanaa, but reflections on my own growth. I wrote about the power of silence, the strength of restraint, and the liberation of acceptance. Each entry became a testament to the evolution of my heart and mind, a record of emotional maturity cultivated in the quiet corners of daily life. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, I noticed a moment that encapsulated this practice of acceptance. Saad had spilled a glass of water, and instead of frustration or embarrassment, he laughed quietly. Sanaa, without judgment, helped clean it up, smiling gently at him. I observed, feeling the subtle rhythm of partnership, the unspoken understanding that defined their relationship. And I realized that acceptance was not about detachment. It was about recognizing and honoring life exactly as it unfolded. I began to notice subtle patterns of gratitude emerging. I felt grateful for their laughter, for the shared moments of quiet connection, for the small gestures of care that did not require acknowledgement. I felt grateful for my own emotional growth, for the lessons learned in restraint, silence, and observation. And I felt grateful for the deep, abiding love that continued to bind us together, even as the forms of our interactions evolved. Acceptance also brought a renewed sense of purpose. I began to engage more fully in my own interests, exploring hobbies and passions that had long been neglected. I spent time reading, tending to the garden, and engaging in small creative projects. These activities brought joy, fulfillment, and a renewed sense of identity independent of my role as mother or observer. Through this practice, I discovered that acceptance is not a single act, but a continuous process. It requires attention, reflection, and a willingness to embrace change without resistance. It requires the courage to observe, to refrain from interference, and to trust that love and connection do not require constant articulation. By the end of Part 8, I had internalized a profound truth. Acceptance is the foundation upon which all other emotional growth rests. It allows for presence without control, love without interference, and joy without expectation. It teaches patience, humility, and the quiet power of observation. And as I closed my journal that night, I felt a deep sense of peace. I understood that my role in Saad and Sanaa's lives had evolved, not diminished. I was no longer the central figure in their daily decisions, but I was still present, still influential, still deeply connected. Acceptance had become my guide, my anchor, my strength. It allowed me to navigate the shifting dynamics of our family with grace, patience, and unwavering love. In the quiet moments, I felt it most profoundly. The freedom to exist fully, to love deeply, and to observe without interference. The freedom to honor life as it is, rather than as I wished it to be. And in that freedom, I discovered a profound truth. The heart grows not through control, not through explanation, but through acceptance. There is a quiet joy in witnessing life unfold without interference. It is unremarkable to the outside eye, almost invisible, but to the one who observes, it carries profound meaning. By the time I reached this stage in my journey, I had embraced silence, restraint, and acceptance. I had learned not to explain myself, not to interject, and not to seek acknowledgement. And yet, I discovered that this quiet practice did not make me irrelevant. On the contrary, it allowed me to see and feel moments that I would have overlooked before. One morning, I noticed Saad quietly humming while preparing coffee. It was an ordinary gesture, almost mundane. But I paused and observed, and in that moment, I felt an unexpected swell of happiness. The simple act reflected contentment, presence, and comfort in his own space. I realized that my love for him did not require dramatic displays or constant involvement. It could exist quietly, appreciating the small details of life. Sanaa joined him shortly afterward, carrying a tray of breakfast. She smiled warmly at him, their interactions seamless, natural, and affectionate. I watched, a subtle warmth spreading through my chest. This was the essence of family, not always in grand declarations, but in small gestures of care, understanding, and shared rhythm. It struck me then that these small moments, though seemingly insignificant, were milestones in their own right. The laughter shared over a spilled cup, the gentle teasing during breakfast, the silent coordination as they worked together in harmony, these were markers of connection, love, and intimacy. I reflected on my own journey. Had I interfered, explained, or corrected, these moments might have been overshadowed. By stepping back, I had allowed authenticity to emerge. The bonds between Saad and Sanaa strengthened not because of my constant guidance, but because of my conscious decision to respect their space and allow their love to flourish naturally. This realization brought another subtle joy, the joy of presence without intrusion. I could exist fully in their lives, observing, appreciating, supporting silently, without the need to justify or explain. I could witness their happiness, their challenges, their growth, and still remain integral, not as a dominant figure, but as a quiet anchor. One afternoon, a minor disagreement arose over weekend plans. In the past, I would have immediately interjected, attempting to mediate or clarify. But now, I simply observed. I watched the nuances of their communication, the way Saad softened his tone, the way Sanaa adjusted her gestures, the way they navigated tension with respect and patience. By allowing them to resolve the situation independently, I saw firsthand the depth of their maturity and partnership. It was a subtle milestone, both in their relationship and in my own growth as a mother. I had relinquished control and, in doing so, allowed them to shine. I began to notice other subtle joys as well. Saad would occasionally glance at me, offering a brief smile or a quiet acknowledgement of presence. These gestures, though fleeting, carried immense emotional weight. They reminded me that love and connection do not require constant validation. They exist in the shared understanding of presence, trust, and mutual respect. Sana, too, showed subtle forms of inclusion. She would ask for my opinion in small matters, share stories, or invite me to participate in quiet routines. These moments were not demands for attention, but expressions of trust and appreciation. They reinforced the truth I had learned, that my presence was valued, even without explicit acknowledgement or constant involvement. Through these observations, I began to understand the profound impact of quiet consistency. My role in their lives had evolved from active guidance to steady presence. And this presence, though subtle, had a lasting influence. It provided stability, emotional safety, and a sense of continuity that words could never fully convey. I also began to see the emotional milestones within myself. The pangs of invisibility that had once haunted me diminished. The urge to explain or justify my feelings dissipated. I discovered a deep sense of satisfaction in witnessing, appreciating, and silently supporting the growth of my family. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, I noticed a small gesture that encapsulated this practice. Saad passed a plate to Sana with a gentle smile, and she responded with a soft laugh and a touch on his arm. I observed, feeling a quiet surge of warmth. These were ordinary actions, yet they carried the weight of trust, affection, and understanding. I realized that emotional milestones are often subtle, unnoticed by the outside world. They are not defined by dramatic declarations, but by small, consistent acts of love, respect, and presence. By embracing silence and restraint, I had positioned myself to witness these milestones fully, appreciating their depth and significance. I began journaling these moments, capturing the quiet milestones that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Each entry reinforced the lesson that love, presence, and connection do not require constant intervention or explanation. They flourish naturally when given space, patience, and trust. The practice of observing without interference also deepened my gratitude. I felt grateful for the laughter, the shared routines, the small gestures of care, and the subtle signs of connection. I felt grateful for my own growth, for the discipline of silence, and for the liberation that came from letting go of the need to explain myself. I discovered that joy is often hidden in the unspoken, the unnoticed, the ordinary. It exists in the rhythm of daily life, in shared glances, in gentle touches, and in quiet acknowledgments. By embracing observation and restraint, I learned to recognize and savor these moments fully. Through this practice, I began to feel a profound sense of harmony. The household, once filled with my explanatory voice and subtle interventions, now hummed with natural rhythm. Saad and Sana's relationship thrived authentically, and my presence, though quieter, remained influential in its stability and support. I noticed a growing sense of emotional resilience within myself. By observing without interference, I had developed patience, empathy, and a deeper understanding of human behavior. I learned to accept change, navigate emotional shifts, and find contentment in my evolving role. The most significant realization, however, came one evening as we sat quietly together. Saad and Sana were discussing weekend plans, laughing softly at a minor miscommunication. I watched, feeling the depth of their bond, the trust and respect they shared, and the subtle joy that filled the room. And in that moment, I understood fully that my love, presence, and influence were no less meaningful because they were quiet. By stepping back, I had allowed them to flourish. By observing without interference, I had discovered a deeper, more enduring form of connection. By the end of Part 9, I had internalized a truth that would guide me through the final stages of this journey. The quiet joys and subtle milestones of life, though often overlooked, carry profound significance. They define relationships, shape emotional growth, and provide a foundation of love and understanding that words cannot capture. I had learned to find fulfillment not in visibility or acknowledgement, but in presence, patience, and the quiet celebration of life as it unfolds. The last part of this journey was not marked by drama, confrontation, or revelation. It was quiet, deliberate, full of reflection and gratitude. By now, I had embraced silence, restraint, observation, and acceptance. I had stopped explaining myself entirely. I had witnessed life unfold without interference, finding profound joy in subtle milestones and deep connection in quiet presence. And yet, it was in this final stage that I discovered the fullness of peace, the emotional culmination of a long, introspective journey. It began on a typical morning. Saad was preparing for work, briefly smiling at me in acknowledgement of my presence. Sana was humming softly in the kitchen, arranging breakfast with a gentle efficiency. I stood by the window, watching the sunlight spill over the garden, the leaves swaying with the morning breeze. The ordinary nature of the moment struck me deeply. This was not a moment that demanded attention, but one that reflected the entirety of my journey. I realized that life had moved forward, not in dramatic leaps, but in small, quiet steps. And in those steps, I had discovered a profound sense of peace. I reflected on the months that had passed. The decision to stop explaining myself had not been simple. There had been moments of doubt, pangs of invisibility, and subtle tensions within me. But each challenge had reinforced the truth I now embraced. Love, presence, and connection do not require constant articulation. They thrive in quiet consistency, patient observation, and acceptance of life as it unfolds. The first true emotional milestone of the morning came unexpectedly. Saad, noticing a small mistake in the breakfast arrangement, smiled at me without words and said, "Mom, thank you for everything. You always notice." It was brief, simple, and unobtrusive. And yet, it carried the weight of acknowledgement I had long ceased seeking. I smiled, a gentle warmth spreading through my chest. I felt seen, not because I demanded recognition, but because I had earned it through consistent presence, quiet support, and patient love. Sana joined him, placing a hand on my shoulder in a subtle gesture of inclusion. "We appreciate you, truly," she said softly, "even if we don't say it all the time." These moments, though fleeting, crystallized the essence of my journey. I had learned that acknowledgement, though comforting, is not the foundation of love. The foundation lies in presence, support, and the freedom to exist fully without seeking validation. Throughout the day, I observed more of these subtle interactions. Saad laughed naturally at a joke from Sana. She adjusted his coffee cup without speaking, a gesture that conveyed care and thoughtfulness. I watched quietly, feeling the depth of their connection and the richness of life unfolding around me. In these observations, I found profound satisfaction. I realized that my love for them no longer depended on being central in every conversation, every decision, every shared moment. My love existed quietly, consistently, and deeply. It was a love not diminished by distance, independence, or subtle shifts in roles. It was strengthened by restraint, patience, and deliberate non-interference. I began to reflect on the personal transformation I had undergone. I had moved from a mother who felt compelled to explain, justify, and intervene in every aspect of her son's life to one who understood the quiet power of restraint. I had learned to trust their independence, to embrace change without resistance, and to find joy in the ordinary, unremarkable moments of shared life. Even in solitude, I discovered peace. I spent afternoons journaling, reading, or tending to the garden, no longer seeking fulfillment solely through my interactions with others. I had developed a sense of identity independent of my role as mother and observer, a quiet, steady confidence in my own presence and purpose. One evening, after dinner, Saad and Sana invited me to sit with them while they shared plans for a weekend getaway. I listened attentively, offering a brief suggestion only when asked, and then returned to quiet observation. Their laughter, gentle debates, and seamless coordination filled me with a deep, almost tangible sense of pride. I had created space for their intimacy, allowing their relationship to flourish without my constant input. In this act of restraint, I discovered a new form of fulfillment. I realized that my presence, though quieter, was more meaningful than it had ever been. I was no longer a mother demanding recognition or a guide shaping every interaction. I was a steady anchor, a witness to growth, a participant in life's subtleties without overshadowing them. Nightfall brought reflection. I sat by the window, a cup of tea in hand, gazing at the garden bathed in soft moonlight. The house was quiet, the day's rhythm settled. I felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling that my role, my love, and my presence were all complete, balanced, and sufficient. I thought back on the lessons I had learned. That love does not require constant explanation. That presence without interference is a profound act of care. That observation allows growth in both others and oneself. That acceptance of change brings freedom and resilience. That joy exists in the subtle, ordinary moments often overlooked. I understood that my journey was not about withdrawal, but about transformation. I had evolved from a mother driven by the need for acknowledgement to one who found strength in quiet presence, fulfillment in subtle joy, and love in unspoken support. The final emotional milestone of the evening came unexpectedly. Saad, noticing the moonlight, said softly, "Mom, we're grateful you're here. Even if we don't always show it, you're part of everything we do." Sanan nodded, adding, "Yes, your presence, your love, it's constant. And it matters more than you realize." Tears welled in my eyes, not of sorrow, but of quiet, profound gratitude. This acknowledgement was not demanded, not expected. It was freely given, authentic, and heartfelt. It reflected everything I had learned, the power of silence, the strength of restraint, and the enduring value of love expressed quietly. In that moment, I felt a sense of completion. My journey, from constant explanations to deliberate silence, from intervention to observation, from longing to acceptance, had reached its emotional culmination. I had discovered peace, joy, and fulfillment not in the visibility of my actions, but in their quiet constancy. I reflected on the years of motherhood, the countless lessons, the subtle shifts, and the profound transformations. And I realized that my love, presence, and influence were never diminished, they had merely evolved. I was no longer central to every moment, yet I was deeply embedded in the fabric of their lives. That night, I closed my journal with a soft sigh, feeling the weight of contentment settle gently over me. I had stopped explaining myself, and in doing so, I had discovered the deepest form of freedom and connection. The house was quiet, the family asleep, and I sat alone in the stillness, fully aware of the love that surrounded me, the life I had nurtured, and the journey I had undertaken. And in that quiet, I understood everything. That love, presence, and fulfillment do not demand explanation. That joy is found in subtle moments and quiet observation, and that the deepest peace comes not from being central, but from simply being steadily, patiently, and lovingly present. I had stopped explaining myself that day, and in that act, I had gained everything: peace, joy, and a quiet, enduring love that would shape our family and my own life forever.